This is Rome. It's beautiful, rich, and prosperous. Let's throw some goths into the mix.
A few moments later.
Well, that didn't go too well.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Hey peasant, work for me or my men will kill you. Isn't that right, men?
We fight wolves barehanded.
You hear that? They'll kick your butt.
And that was the start of feudalism.
Okay, jokes aside, let's get to the facts. After Rome's fall at around 470 CE, Europe was in chaos. Without one big empire to boss everyone around, a lot of smaller kingdoms with no real cohesion fought. They tried to take control of Rome's lost land, but they needed an economic solution to make them prosperous. So, to resolve this issue, slowly, a system was implemented, and over time, people knew it and they knew their roles in this new system. This new system was called feudalism. Feudalism was a social system where the rich gave the poor people land to rent and to work. Also, they were given protection because the land was tied to the lord. In return, the lord was given a cut of the harvest. He was also given compulsory military service from the peasants. So when the king called on him, he would have to give a certain amount of troops to the king's army. There were 6 classes in the feudal system, the first of which are peasants or serfs. They were farmers who did not own the land that they worked. Above them were freeholding farmers, peasants who owned the land that they worked, as well as merchants and craftsmen. Above them were knights who helped collect taxes and defend the fiefdom. Above these knights, there were the lords and nobles, who owned the fiefdom and taxed the peasants. They were also vassals to the monarch. Above these lords, there was the monarch, who controlled a vast amount of vassals who pledged allegiance, and in times of war, they would pledge troops to his banner. Above this, you could put the clergy and the church, who in most places were exempt from taxation and conscription into the military. They also held a large amount of sway over public opinion because they were the people who represented the god that everyone believed in. Peasants, by far, had the most unique characteristics. Just kidding, they were 90% of the population, and all they did,
And all that their small brains were capable of.
was farm. Peasants got very few luxuries, such as living and only getting what they made by hand, such as a wool shirt or a blanket, if they had sheep or could afford wool. Also, everything a serf had could be taken by his lord, so they were almost slaves, but in one key difference, they could not be bought or sold. Peasants would only eat meat that they herded or bought, because they could not hunt on the lord's land that they rented. This was also a problem because they couldn't hunt any rats or rabbits that ate their crops without the lord's permission. Also, they weren't the smartest of individuals. Not having an education at all, or generally just being in bad health because of their poor living conditions, would result in a short lifespan.
What did the peasants do on a daily basis? Well, they woke up early and got to work in the fields before working a very long time with very little break until lunch around 3:30 to 4, before going back into fields and then going back to their homes to eat dinner around 7 or 8 before going to bed. This kind of life was average for a peasant. But some days were different. Some days they got to do things like going to the market, during the fall after a long harvest, they would go to the mill. They would go to the mill to grind up wheat into flour. But this kind of life was only for men. For women, it was different. For women, you would generally work in the house and make food and clean for your family, with some external stuff such as running a small vegetable farm to feed your children. But at harvest and planting, it got so busy that everybody. Now, what kind of power did over 90% of the existing population have? I'll tell you. Practically nothing. Despite being the source of most kingdoms' resources, peasants and the lower classes got little to no control over their lives or positions. If you were born a peasant, you would always be a peasant. You may be thinking, if they made up over 90% of the population, why didn't they just revolt like the French or George Washington? Well, a bunch of starving illiterates don't really make good revolutionaries.